So first, a short introduction. We're the Platypus Affiliated Society. We host reading groups and public fora designed to and research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s, left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. If you are interested, we host reading groups here at the New School at 4 to 6:30 p.m. on Thursdays in the Lang building. Just talk to one of us and we'll give you the room number. We have coffee breaks Mondays 12 to 2 p.m. in the Lang Cafe, where we discuss any topics relevant to the left today. Come with concerns, questions, or anything really. Today,
we can't do amplification for teachers. We have other things and other programming going on, so if you're doing a teaching, it's the no amplification.
No amplification.
Okay.
Okay.
That's fine.
All right.
There's going to be people doing other talks and stuff elsewhere.
So not the introduction to it. Maybe just announce that we're starting, and then we'll do the rest without the amplification. So maybe just tell people we're starting.
We'll be starting now. The topic today is going to be what were the student protests in 1968. So today, the inheritance of 1968 is evoked in student protests, occupations, and amongst the student left across the United States and internationally, which leaves open a question: what was the student protest movement in 1968? What was the history preceding it? And what were the end goals that they envisioned in that moment? How is it used and potentially abused for the left today in this moment? And without further ado, the president of Platypus Affiliated Society, our speaker for this teach-in, Erin Hagood.
Hi everybody. Thank you so much for having me. So as Athene said, I'm the current president of the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm also a member of our chapter at Columbia University. So I prepared this teach-in for Columbia University, for our chapter there, where, as you all know, these occupations started. I've done a lot of reading, and I've tried also to kind of edit it since then, so you guys are getting a more polished version. But I am going to ask you guys to bear with me. I went through a lot of material. I'm going to put a lot on the table, but I hope that it allows us to have a really great discussion and to open up questions. That's kind of the spirit of the whole thing. Okay, so I'm just going to get going. Last Wednesday, the students of Columbia University's Apartheid Divest Coalition, led by Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace, erected an encampment, a liberated zone with posters copied straight from the Columbia occupation of 1968. As this encampment began, Columbia's president, Shafiq, was sitting before Congress to testify about the rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses. When she returned to campus, President Shafiq ordered the destruction of the encampments and the arrest of over 100 student protesters. Since then, the campus has been closed to visitors amid continuing protests, including protests by faculty and the erection of a new encampment. The students have demanded financial transparency, divestment from the war in Israel and Gaza, and a boycott of Israeli intellectuals and students through the Tel Aviv University Exchange Program, among other newer demands, such as amnesty for arrested students and a commitment to academic freedom. The occupation of campus has seemed to many to be a spontaneous uprising of students, followed by similar spontaneous acts of solidarity from campuses across America, and now spreading across the world in Austria, France, Australia, and elsewhere. Such spontaneity would seem to defy theoretical understanding, but it is also misleading, for even spontaneity has its context. Men make history, but not in the conditions of their choosing. The radical posture of the protests are, in effect, preparing the way for the anti-Trump, anti-fascist Popular Front incorporation of the radical students into electoral politics. We have to confront this sobering fact. This cycle of student protest was born in the 1930s and repeated itself in the arc of the New Left from 1964 to 1972. So perhaps counterintuitively, for discussing the New Left protest movements that had slogans such as, "We can't get bogged down in analysis," and "Whoever occupies himself with theory without acting practically is a traitor to socialism," I'm going to start our discussion with two professors, Marxists Herbert Marcuse and Theodore Adorno. In their private correspondence about the 1968 to 69 student protests, they debate the relationship of the New Left radicals of the 60s to the politics of the 1930s. Adorno, in particular, is often considered a pessimist and critic of the New Left, not only for his written criticisms of the student movement, but for calling the police on students occupying and disrupting his lecture in Frankfurt in 1969. Following this incident, students continued to protest with the somewhat infamous titty attack, in which naked students waved their breasts in his face while throwing tulips on his head and chanting, "Adorno as an institution is dead," forcing Adorno to cancel his disrupted lectures for the rest of the semester. Herbert Marcuse, though originally sympathetic to Adorno, became quite critical of him after speaking to one of the Frankfurt student protesters about the incident. Though Marcuse agreed with Adorno that the police can and should be called even by leftists if the occupation threatens to descend into violence or to destroy property and items necessary to the continuation of education, he felt Adorno should not have called the police on the students in this instance. Adorno, of course, claimed that such a threat was exactly why he had taken that measure, but the two quickly realized that the heart of their disagreement had remarkably little to do with whether the police ought to have been called in that specific instance. Rather, their disagreement had a political context. Adorno, borrowing a term from Jürgen Habermas, warned that the student movement threatened to descend into what he called left fascism, that it would bring about the technocratization of the university that it claimed to oppose, and that its opposition to thought was regressive, justifying and alibying the status quo it wanted to disrupt while blocking the creation of an authentic critical theory. Marcuse took issue with this formulation. He felt left fascism was a contradiction in terms, and that the self-contradiction of the left was not leading to the left becoming its opposite, to the left becoming the right, as Adorno claimed. Marcuse said that although it was not a revolutionary or even a pre-revolutionary situation in the late 1960s, theory might be pushed further by praxis, and that this was what was happening in what Adorno called the thoughtless actions of the student protesters. Not the thoughtlessness of fascism, but a praxis that could lead to further and new thought. Adorno articulated the crux of their controversy thusly: "You, Marcuse, think that praxis in its emphatic sense is not blocked today. I think differently." The two men, now teachers of the New Left with a large influence on the protests around the globe, had in their youth, back in the 30s and 40s, faced a similar demand to act and had opposed it. Adorno replies to Marcuse, quote, "The strongest point that you make is the idea that the situation could be so terrible that one would have to break out of it, even if one recognizes the objective impossibility. I take this argument seriously, but I think that it is mistaken. We withstood in our time, you no less than me, a much more dreadful situation, that of the murder of the Jews, without proceeding to praxis, simply because it was blocked for us. I think that clarity about that streak of coldness in oneself is a matter of self-contemplation. To put it bluntly, I think that you are deluding yourself in being unable to go without participating in the student stunt because of what is occurring in Vietnam or Biafra. If that really is your reaction, then you should not only protest against the horror of napalm bombs, but also against the unspeakable Chinese-style tortures that the Viet Cong carry out permanently. If you do not take that on board too, then the protest against the Americans takes on an ideological character." As my former mentor at the University of Chicago, Atia Khan, wrote in her 2009 article for the Platypus Review, titled "The Decline of the Left in the 20th Century, 1968, The unification of praxis with a non-existent theory by the protesters recalled for Adorno the emergence of counter-revolution expressed in the form of fascism and Stalinism that had ensued in the aftermath of the crisis of 1917, leading to the disintegration of revolutionary Marxism by the 1930s and generating an acute problem of consciousness on the left. So again, it's about the relationship of what's happening in the 60s to the earlier old left movement of the 30s. In the post-war period, the devastation of the left was supplanted by an authoritarian character structure that was expressed universally, not only in the fascist rallies, but also in the popular front movements, as well as in the anti-colonial nationalist movements of the Third World. Frankfurt School theorists, including Adorno, theorized the notion of the authoritarian personality as a double-sided expression of counter-revolutionary and simultaneously revolutionary potential that was rooted in the dialectical contradiction of capitalism. Borrowing from Freudian psychoanalysis, Adorno and his colleagues, Marcuse and Reich, interpreted the constitution of the authoritarian personality, characterized by narcissism and sadomasochism, as evincing a regressive fear of freedom. Thus, faced with political hysteria, Adorno observed, quote, those who protest most vehemently are similar to authoritarian personalities in their aversion to introspection. Certainly the 1960s then marked a political crisis, but one in which the left, instead of evaluating the legacy of the 1930s Stalinism that might persist, reproduced those very structures and tendencies that it sought authentically to overthrow. So the protests of 1968 imagine themselves to be in some way a progressive overcoming of the Stalinist Marxist left of the 1930s. But what if it was only a further regression? What if the apparent radicalization of the left was actually a repression of the most pressing historical problem, namely the need to theoretically work through the bloc to emancipatory praxis? These questions are at the heart of the debate between Marcuse and Adorno. And this debate between professors articulates, I believe in a fundamental way, the theoretical problems at the core of the New Left of the 1960s and the student protests of 1968. Then as now, Columbia was the ground zero for student protests. The Columbia occupation of 1968 began when the Student Afro-American Society occupied Hamilton Hall to protest the Vietnam War and to demand that Columbia halt construction of a Columbia student-only gym in Harlem. According to Mark Rudd, this action and the subsequent barricade erected by the students in Hamilton Hall radicalized the white middle class Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, of which he was a leader. The oppressed, in the form of black people in America and the oppressed Third World in Vietnam as elsewhere, according to Rudd, took the vanguard and awakened the students to their opposition to the system. However, the SDS students did not want to disconnect themselves from the base of students by remaining behind the barricade, so they set up a separate white occupation. They had learned, according to Rudd, from Black Power activist Stokely Carmichael that, quote, blacks and whites must organize their own. This radicalization of the SDS and the organizational form it took in segregated occupations was not spontaneous, but had been prepared by the history of the SDS and the New Left's role in the civil rights movement. Founded in 1960, Students for a Democratic Society was a catch-all for refugees of the New Left, a generation of young radicals and leftists who felt that they could not find a home in either the aged and anti-communist Socialist Party or the Stalinized Communist Party. Its prominent leaders, Michael Harrington, who would later go on to found the DSA, and mentors like Bayard Rustin, came from the Trotskyist tradition within the American Socialist Party. They led these new students into the civil rights movement, where they worked with SNCC and CORE to organize mass sit-ins against segregation and voting drives to register then juridically disenfranchised Southern black people to vote. The coup de grace of this organizing came in 1963, when Bayard Rustin organized 2 days of mass protests in the nation's capital, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. But triumph comes before the fall. In 1964, the U.S. was swept into a presidential election, the incumbent Democrat Lyndon B. Johnson against Barry Goldwater. Deep in the Jim Crow South in Mississippi, activists in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party had organized alternative meetings and votes to put forward delegates, including a significant number of black delegates, for the upcoming Democratic National Convention. in defiance of the Dixiecrats' segregated white-only Democratic Party. When these delegates were denied seats at the 1964 DNC in Atlantic City, they left to boycott the convention and hold an alternative meeting. When LBJ announced that no future DNC would be segregated in response to the demands of the delegation, Bayard Rustin, the hero of 1963, now scared of the right-wing threat coming from Barry Goldwater, urged the delegation to take the deal. Feeling angry and betrayed, the delegation refused, and Black Power was born. Within youth organizations like SDS and also SNCC, which the next year expelled its white members, this transformed into the belief that white and black radicals would have to organize separately, since the white radicals did not face the same oppression and could not be trusted to support the radical demands of the movement. Bayard Rustin criticized the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the beginnings of these developments in his 1965 article, From Protest to Politics. SDS members Carl Davidson and Greg Calvert of the SDS's new Praxis Axis countered this article with their own slogan, From Protest to Resistance, calling for base building and resistance to U.S. imperialism rather than the old social democratic strategy of realigning the Democratic Party. Greg Calvert had picked up the slogan of resistance from his time in Tunis with the Algerian resistance to French imperialism. The Praxis Axis looked toward figures such as Andre Gortz, Antonio Gramsci, Herbert Marcuse, and French neo-Marxists, among others, recovering Marx to explain class and develop a revolutionary praxis through a criticism of the New Left. They looked to the new working class of black workers, students, and women to supplant the traditional working class focus on the left and provide new revolutionary force in the context of a quiescent labor movement. Mark Rudd's Columbia SDS of 1968 was a product of this earlier history. Rudd was highly critical of the Praxis Axis, which was at the time of 1968, the majority tendency in the SDS at Columbia. Writing that, quote, though possessing a Marxist analysis, they believed that the way support is gained is by going out to the people and talking to them about this analysis. When a colonel from the Select Service Committee running the draft for Vietnam was scheduled to speak at Columbia, the Praxis Axis majority voted to attend the talk and, quote, ask probing questions. This was not enough for Rudd and his emerging opposition. They decided action was necessary. So as the colonel was speaking, they landed a pie squarely in his face. According to Rudd, this was the coolest thing the SDS ever did. This new radical wing of the SDS called itself the Action Faction and sought to promote direct action through occupations and confrontations. Spurred by the occupation of Hamilton Hall by the SAS, the SDS called on the general student body to occupy campus and Low Library, which culminated in the police arrest of 1,000 protesting students after the disruption of classes for a whole week. This action sparked similar protests across the world. In Three Student Risings, an article by Fawthorpe, Nairn, and Treisman, they describe the occupation of 3 universities in Great Britain. The demands of these occupations are what is broadly described as the demand for student power, which included greater student control over universities and education under capitalism. So student power here is kind of like black power. It's the students organizing themselves to control the university where they work every day and live. This raised the question of the relationship of the university and the students to society as a whole. The 3 wrote, quote, universities are linked to a set of productivity norms which, in order to be met, need a system as authoritarian as any other factory. Expose that by linking it with outside repressive forces, and the first cracks will appear in the facade. When the outside, and they're thinking here of like the police, insists on coming inside, we will know 2 things. 1, we will lose. But the loss of socialism on one campus is inevitable and should stimulate support in all the others during the really hard struggle. 2, we will have won, because we will force the administration to openly show their relation to the capitalist machine and the institutions' implicit aim of producing a new generation of managers to rule the working class, end quote. So recognizing the students as future managers of capitalism, they wondered if radical students can question the status quo and work for socialism while embracing that sort of managerial role. This was not a new problem, but had been a central part of the student protests and strikes dating all the way back to the 30s. in which students had protested the destruction of academic freedom, labor issues, the anti-communism of the academy, the authoritarian administration of the university, and the specter of a Second World War and attendant draft. Many declaring at the time in the 1930s that they would support the capitalist war machine. In the 1930s, as in the 1960s, the students demanded action, radical action. The Student League for Industrial Democracy, or SLID, which is an important precursor to the SDS, wrote all the way back in the 30s, the radical movement has too many sideline commentators. The great need is for participants. Besides, action is one of the best ways of getting clarification. So there's a demand for action to be taken against the university in order to learn. So members of the student movement of the 1930s Old Left fought over the importance of student issues and how they connected to the outside world. The basis of their protest of the university was, in fact, its role in the progressive state that had emerged since the First World War, and their role as students in reproducing that state management of the working class. But it was unclear what it would mean to oppose such things. As FDR embarked on New Deal programs, courting the support of labor unions and the Communist Party, which was a major influence on the young students at the time, shifted towards a popular front strategy of alliance with capitalist politicians against the threat of fascism, the student movement broke apart. They were no longer able to justify an anti-war stance in opposition to FDR and the Democratic Party. Hal Draper, a major figure in the Brooklyn College protest of 1934, wrote after 4 years of eviscerating the student anti-war movement for the sake of the Grand Alliance against Nazism, the Second World War was inaugurated with the Hitler-Stalin Pact. The students followed the communist-led Popular Front into the Democratic Party and went all in for FDR's third term. Draper wrote, looking back on this in the 60s, that this was the death of the student movement. These arguments about the relationship of student power to society and the role of the student protests in capitalist politics were on the table during the 1968 student protests. Mark Rudd was not that sanguine about the student power wing of the student protesters, writing, quote, "The student powerization of the Columbia Rebellion and the New Left in general is an attempt on the part of the ruling class to diffuse the social and political content of our movement." And here I'm quoting directly, okay, so this is Mark Rudd. "Rip its guts out, tear off its balls, and substitute some sort of faggoty, wimpy, tepid, we love your system, but it needs reform McCarthyite gook in its place." Okay, so he has a lot of feelings about this. McCarthyite here does not refer to Senator McCarthy of the Red Scare, but rather to Eugene McCarthy, an anti-war candidate in the Democratic Party running against LBJ in the primary that year, which was supported by many student leftists, including some in the student power wing. The new left radicals of 1968 were facing again the old problems and questions that had been posed in the 1930s. How does a student work towards the socialist revolution? What is socialism? How should the left relate to capitalist parties like the Democratic Party? How do students relate to the working class? Should one be anti-fascist or anti-imperialist? The young leftists saw the history laid out before them, the betrayal of the communists and the liquidation of the radicals into a popular front strategy, the institutionalization of revolution to support the never-ending march of capitalism, and they resented it. Rudi Dutschke, a leader of the SDS and student protests in Germany, believed that the last 50 years of the German workers' movement, from 1918 to 1968, were nothing but a chain of betrayals by leftist and rightist intellectuals. In the thesis of protesting students from the Sorbonne, they write, "Let us not allow our goals to be assimilated as those of the proletariat have been." Daniel and Gabrielle Combendit, in their essay on the May student uprisings in Paris, specified this assimilation. They believed that the Bolshevik Revolution led to bureaucratization, and that their contemporary Marxists of all stripes, quote, "look upon the proletariat as a mass that needs to be directed from above." They identified this mistake in the creation of a Marxist Party for Socialism. The Cobendy brothers argued that Lenin, who in his famous pamphlet What is to be Done said that consciousness must come to the proletariat from without, had thus condemned the proletarian revolution to failure and bureaucracy. They saw the student action as a corrective to the failures of the party. They would not theorize consciousness and attempt to lead the workers through the constitution of such a party. Rather, the students would, quote, encourage the workers to struggle on their own behalf and show how their every struggle can be used to drive a wedge into capitalist society. Duchka also pointed back to the failure of the Marxist revolutionaries and parties of the early 20th century, who had betrayed the workers in 1914 when they voted in favor of war credits, beginning World War I and sending the proletarians of all countries to fight each other in imperialist war instead of making international revolution. At the time, the Marxist leaders of the Second International Social Democratic Parties argued that they had to support the war because they would lose the support of the working class majority if they did not. In so doing, they sacrificed what Duchka called the historic interests of the producers for their immediate interests. Student protests were seen as an historically specific corrective to this defeat in Duchka's imagination. For Duchka, the historically correct limitation of art action to the university should not be made into a fetish. In the students, as in the lumpen proletariat of the Third World, the immediate interest was the same as the historic interest of the producers. Theory could be derived directly from the needs and actions of the present, with no need for a party or a group of intellectuals to mediate the problem. Historically, Marxists argued for the merger of socialist intellectuals and the working class movement in an independent socialist party. This was the thesis of Second International leader Karl Kautsky. In this party, a socialist politics would be developed through theoretical and practical struggle. The radicals of 1968, seeing that this was not happening, sought to sidestep the question of forming a party by promoting the unity of action between the students and the oppressed of the Third World. But this emphasis on spontaneity was only the flip side of the organization the Stalinists had held up when they kicked out the intellectuals and liquidated the historical Bolshevik Party in the Communist International in the name of supporting socialism in one country. Both jettisoned the dialectic in favor of a one-sided actionism. The dialectical tension between spontaneity and organization, between theory and practice, between the workers and the intellectuals, which the Marxist Party of Socialism had tried and failed to work through, is lost. The students of the 1968 protests hoped that through radical action and support for the oppressed, they could overcome their role as intellectuals, stuck in the tired debates they inherited from the old world, and join with a truly revolutionary practice. In this way, they would overcome the crimes and betrayals of Stalinism and the socialists of the past. For them, it was time for action, not thought. As the Cobendy brothers write, between us, we can change this rotten society. Now, put on your coat and make for the nearest cinema. Look at their deadly lovemaking on the screen. Isn't it better in real life? Make up your mind to learn to love. Then, during the interval, when the first advertisement comes on, pick up your tomatoes, or if you prefer your eggs, and chuck them. Then get out into the street and peel off all the latest government proclamations until underneath you discover the message of the days of May and June. Stay a while in the street. Look at the passers-by and say to yourself, the last word has not yet been said. Then act. Act with others, not for them. Make the revolution here and now. It is your own. So the students acted in 1968, and their confrontation with police batons and bullets made national headlines. But the tragedy of the spring gave way to the farce of the summer. At the 1968 DNC, anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy ceded the nomination to Herbert Humphrey, LBJ's former vice president. Outside of the gates of the convention, the students of 68 were burning their bras and shouting in protest. Inside the convention, Bayard Rustin, that old hero of the civil rights movement, was working the floor for Humphrey to stop the looming threat of Richard Nixon. But the students wouldn't have to remain outside for long. In 1972, for the nomination of New Left favorite George McGovern, student radicals would be invited inside the convention. He even set up racial, gender, and age quotas to ensure that the Democratic Party was really representing these new young rebels, these new forces. The radical street protest of 4 years earlier became a new Popular Front strategy, going all in to stop the evil Richard Nixon. Those who were left out became sectarian Marxists, anarchists, and even terrorists. 1968 was not the birth of the New Left, but its death. Not its greatest success, but the final protest against its failure before an accommodation to a new reality. Earlier this year, thousands of youth wrote ceasefire onto ballots for the Democratic Party primaries that aren't. The radical protests that we see today are the Democratic primary that was canceled for the coronation of Genocide Joe. And Palestine is Bernie Sanders, now that Bernie is all in for Biden. The protests will denounce the crimes of capitalism, and some protesters may even resist to their last breath, even when the crowds have all gone home. But for what? What will these actions have to do with socialism? What does it have to do with Marxism? We see already that, just as Adorno warned the New Left, the protests have inaugurated a new regime of censorship and bureaucratic management on campuses that the students oppose. Could it not be the case that, like the New Left, the students copy, they will become their opposite, a new right, and that all the radical phrases, happenings, and confrontation will only prepare the very capitalist domination they're seeking now to subvert? What time is it on the historical clock? Maybe when we look ahead and at what we hope is a new future, we will just see Theodore Adorno looking over his shoulder and winking at us, a tulip still on his head. We are repeating history without, however, the political content of the New Left crisis, which forced young people to reconsider their relationship to historical struggles for freedom and to historical Marxism. Today, protests copy all the effects of 1968, but not a word is said about its relationship to history. In the face of such a repetition, one may want to say something, to stop our peers from going down the path of the past, but it's far too late for that. This repetition has already happened. Today, the abandonment of the task of socialist revolution and reconstituting an emancipatory politics has already been completed by the millennials in favor of working within the progressive state and the Democratic Party. One either goes along with it or protests the fait accompli. In 1914, Rosa Luxemburg wrote that the world was faced with two alternatives, socialism or barbarism. Today, we live in the aftermath of the failed revolution for socialism, which has left us with nothing except for barbarism. In barbarism, humanity is a will-less football. But Rosa Luxemburg wrote that there was still hope if we have not unlearned how to learn. Unable to understand the historical meaning of our own activity, we liquidate our only hope for changing our conditions in the name of action, which may be completely amenable to the continuation of capitalism to the Greek colonies. Nobody believes that the protests will end the war. They just want to do something, anything, in the face of the horror. But suppression of the task of socialism and dealing with the historical failures of Marxism in the name of radical action will only kick the can down the road to another generation, making the avowed left allies of continued regression and progenitors of new obstacles to the very freedom they seek. Today, we have unlearned how to learn. Can we learn it again?
Okay.
Okay, we're now going to open up the Q&A. If anyone has any questions for Erin, feel free to
discussion too.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for, I know that was long. Thank you guys for listening to me through that. But yeah, it would be great to discuss any questions, comments, criticisms.
So we do have a question from the chat.
Oh,
If-
cool, there's a chat. Let's go
Yes,
for it.
okay,
Nobody's here.
there's
Everybody
anyone
in
else.
person gets precedence over
Right.
the internet, but
Anyone at the moment? Okay.
yeah.
Okay, Erin, are you calling the Palestinian encampment left fascist?
I'm saying, yeah, that's a possibility. I mean, I think the question is to understand what Adorno meant by that. Like, what was meant by left fascism and what was meant by the idea that the left could become its opposite, namely the right? That's what he's saying. And that's why I brought up the question of the authoritarian personality and that complex. I mean, I think for Adorno, the authoritarian personality is kind of it's a political problem that's been transposed into psychology precisely because we don't have the facility to deal with it politically. And the political problem is that when the left failed to make the revolution, it liquidated itself into the counter-revolution, right? So his kind of argument is that after the failure of the 1917 revolution, and really through socialism in one country, the left actually became the right. They didn't just abandon their task, they actually actively ushered in the counter-revolution against socialism, right? That's the argument. And so what he thinks is happening is a sort of like repetition of that without like the immediate political content of the fight over the meaning of 1917, right? And the Comintern and the Second International. And so what is fascism? For him, it's a reflection of Stalinism. It's sort of it's a symptom of the failure of the left to make the revolution, right? And so who makes the revolution in the failure of the left? Actually, the right makes the revolution. They make a counter-revolution. And that takes the form of fascism, but it has a relationship to Stalinism, which is also adapting to and sometimes alibiing that counter-revolution. Okay, so that's like what left fascism meant. It comes from Jürgen Habermas, who used it to describe what he was seeing. And so the idea is that it's really about a thoughtlessness. It's about a lack of theory. It's about the unity of action with an unthinking theory, right? That sacrifices a clarification of the end goal in the name of just acting. And he thinks that has, the propensity to descend into violence, which of course it did, in the case of fascism, but also in the case of new left terrorism in the 70s and the recrudescence of anarchism. And what is he saying? He's saying, well, I want to treat all of these things immanently and dialectically. So Adorno's never like for or against something. He's not there to just affirm something. He's also not there to just say something's bad. You know, he's famous for the thumbs down thing. He's there to try and understand things not as they are, but as they ought to be, as they could be. And so he thinks this authoritarian personality, which is a kind of a complete subjection of oneself, right, to like an irrational end and to rationality, right? You're going to basically reify your means and ends. And the means might even become an end in itself, so your action's going to become an end in itself. He thought that, well, if you kind of pursue that, and he would say it's a form of reification, to its logical endpoint, then actually you'll come up against the limitations of your irrational end, and you'll be forced to consider, even if negatively, why you're acting the way you are, and that should bring up historical problems. So he thinks that, like, there is both a to the fear of freedom. It's what Reich called the progressive character of fascism. So for him, the fact that the left has become the right isn't like a specific, it's not like the students are the first to do this. This happened already in the 30s. And he's saying the students are actually reacting against this, but because they don't know why this has happened, because they haven't clarified the relationship of theory and praxis and the problems inherited from that betrayal, they're actually kind of, despite themselves, repeating it. So he's not trying to say that the students are like horrible or something, but he is saying that the students are like subjected to this history that informs their spontaneous action that they don't know about and that they haven't worked through. That's the point of left fascism. But yeah, that is something that's like, okay, Adorno thought that's what it was in 68. If we're replaying 68, is there a sort of left fascism now? I do think we've gone through a period where the left has become the right and accommodated itself to political reality. And that's what these protests are kind of a reaction against. That's, I think, been the experience of the millennial left of now the last 20 years. Is sort of playing again that new left question of, okay, can we break from the past, from these failures of the past, and not going to be able to do it? And that seems to me to condition what's happening today. So that's why I started with them. Also because I found it, I don't know if you guys noticed this, but when you read through all these different people in the protests, you get radically different ideas of what's going on. And I felt that the debate between Marcuse and Adorno actually kind of highlights what is there in all of these different instantiations of the protest movement, right? That it's about theory and practice, and how can you have a truly revolutionary praxis, And is it possible? Is it possible to act, or do we face mainly theoretical problems? And if it's not possible to act, what's the obstacle? That's sort of why I started there. Even though I knew it would potentially be a provocative place to start. But I thought it would help us think about our relationship to this history.
Professor, I saw your countenance. Eli, speak up.
And I'm not surprised at how much spoiling, but I didn't know that. Because it's just so reactionary to assimilate the fascism. And fascism is not a left that has gone south. It has different social roots, it has different ideology, it has a different character, and so forth. It is, of course, the case that mass movements, mass actions can, to use Freudian terms, they force this regression. And that's why mass movements like the French Revolution and so forth are so fantastic, because that's where you discover new possibilities. That was obviously the case during the 1960s. The 1960s were genuine. They weren't just reacting to the failures. And they're not really failures. Some of them are failures, but the so-called old left. So, yeah, I mean, there are dangers in mass action. I think this is great, what's going on outside. I mean, just consider the question of Palestine. You just had a living horror going on decade after decade. And now we brought it out in these demonstrations. And I just think it's fantastic. I love the students who are doing that. And this happened or that happened, yeah. So, I don't know.
Professor, what do you think? Okay, great. I was wondering, this was something that I was thinking about when I was reading through all this stuff in the 60s. Because I was, trying to understand what's new and what's old, and it can be really hard actually looking back to distinguish that. What would you say was new from the 60s? That kind of
The 60s had a completely different social basis. The old left, so-called old left, which was fantastic at various moments. But still, it was so grounded in the working class and the new left completely broke out of that and invented many of the rhetoric and the philosophy that the left very important has today in terms of cultural issues, sexual issues, diversity, participation, democracy. These are genuine theoretical discoveries. Hagood understood that, but Dorland did not understand it. All of that was new. The women's movement is coming out of the new left. It reacts against the new left, asserting the need for a separate women's movement, separate women's identity, and so forth. That's another matter. That is really what ended the new left. Not it didn't turn out to the right. And then you have someone like Sanders doesn't represent accommodating capitalism. On the contrary, Sanders was fantastic what Sanders did. I mean, right now, of course, he's totally behind him. One thing that this moment in the history of the left, see, I think you have to have like a really long-run perspective. The left is always going to lose until it finally wins. But it's not, but, you know, I mean, it's like, I've watched it through the whole month. They can't tell it. They've done everything they can. I mean, like, the new left was such an amazing phenomenon, and the dominant forces did everything they could to just, like, left fascism and all of those kinds of terms. They did everything they could to destroy the left, and here we are again. But you know, there are really dominant forces in the world, capitalist forces. So it's a struggle. You know, it's a struggle that has been going on for a long time before capitalism. One issue that relates to the specific question that is raised in which is massive crowds, which is really going to be a repeat of 68, is what's going to happen at the Democratic Convention. Because on the one hand, how could people suddenly realize the nature of what has been going on in Palestine and its very much larger significance? It's part of American imperialism. It's part of the whole coalition. The U.S. had the possibility of having a two-state solution a long time ago. Kissinger in the 1970s says, "Oh no, we're not going to do that. We're going to wipe out the Soviet Union. Once we get rid of the Soviet Union, we'll do whatever we want." And this is what they've done in, you know, Iraq. So of course we want to demonstrate at the convention and so forth. But you know, it's absolutely true that it's going to benefit Trump. That kind of convention. It's absolutely true that it's part of the I don't have anything to say about that. I don't have any advice about it. I mean, I actually there's a book called The Unraveling by George Orwell. It's not a very good book. I'm not recommending it. I'm looking around and people in my class. It's not very good. But he says America unravels and then it re-ravels. He gives the example of the American Revolution and the Civil War and so forth. Like the 1960s was a true unraveling. You really saw. If you see this movie, that at the end of the movie, you can really see that the U.S. could go in two different directions. You really see that the U.S. had the power in 1945 to actually try to establish basic parameters of world peace. And Roosevelt would have done it. That was Franklin Roosevelt. Had he not quite. And it also had the option, which is what it did, is to, you know, increase war and so forth. And the 1960s, the way I see the left, that was a real moment when there was really a chance to really see the possibilities for the U.S. of going in that direction. Anyway,
I wonder what you make of, I mean, I think what people encounter today, and I've heard this argument from people on the left today, it's kind of something that people, when they relate to the new left, have to grapple with, is that, like, a lot of these new social forces, you know, these groups that the new left really thought were outside of, like, the capitalist administered state. right? They kind of felt like the workers had been completely incorporated into the system, and that part of the reason that the women were radical, or the black struggle was radical, or the third world struggle was radical, was because it was outside of them. And I think what people see is that just seems to be part of capitalist politics now. And some people attribute that to McGovern, which is kind of what I was thinking of. Maybe it is kind of about the McGovern campaign in the 70s. But it seems like all of the things that, for the New Left were radical, for us is this is the language that the administrators of Columbia University use to deal with this sort of thing.
Diversity.
Yeah, diversity and inclusion, and we need to include all of the different movements. And they love 1968. It's on their website. And the struggle continues, and we're always getting better. We're always including more and more of these people who've been outside. Yeah. And that is, what we have now is it's kind of woke and radical capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, capitalism is not a simple negative force. If you read Marx, the Roman Empire expanded by conquest, had to expand by conquest. Capitalism has internal modes of reforming itself and developing. If you read Marx, relative surplus value as opposed to absolute surplus value. The fact that the capitalists, or bourgeoisie, or whatever the ruling class, or the elites, or whatever you want to call it, adopt slogans from the left, or ideas from the left. Of course they do. And that's not completely negative, but it's pretty negative. So, the new left, for historic reasons, evolved into identity politics. And identity politics is very divisive, very easy to co-opt, and so
Yeah. So, I guess, since you say capitalism has a means of reforming itself, I guess I have a question, though, that, what obviously is motivating this occupation, this protest, this moment, is, the abject brutality of what's going on in Palestine at the moment. And I guess I have a thought from Benjamin in the work of Love the Age of Encampment for Reproducibility, that the aestheticization of politics, that futurism expresses the revolt against the forces of production, but in actuality, it's another expression of the one-sided relation between relative surplus value. That in order to control the crisis of capitalism, the capitalist politics is drawn into ever more destructive international wars. And so a real question, I guess, is that, how does one escape this cycle of international war or civil war or the destruction of politics without at some level recognizing the fact that this raises the necessity and the possibility of socialist politics, which becomes abandoned to the extent that the only ends of such political movements that today evince the left are contained within, reform or stopping war, resistance, right?
Over there.
Benjamin was raise my voice. So, it's a very, very dangerous situation for the world, because the people, what happens, and this is what Benjamin captured, relative surplus value actually captures this. You have the increase in technology without an increase in political understanding. do not have the capacity to actually get control. Climate change is an obvious example of that, but you know, the wars and so forth, dangers of nuclear support. That's why you need a left. And that's why it is very important. That's why the left is a very complicated phenomenon, and you can't reduce to mass demonstrations. That's one aspect of it. Very important aspect. But, you know, the left, I remember, like, I was a young college student in the 1960s, and Jimmy Weinstein, I don't know if you know, like, came in, he said, well, we need a journal to sort of give ideas, shape the new left and critique. And I said, what do you need that for? Look, we have the new left. It's already there. And he said, that's just a mess. You know, that's not going to evolve. And he was right. I understood that. And there were a lot of efforts made in the 1960s, like the University Conference, DSA, you mentioned Michael Herrick. There were a lot of efforts. So the left does have to take a long view, be rational, be analytic, and try to contradiction with, you know, having mass observations. So.
I mean, I think that. Oh, go ahead.
We've got a stack, if that's okay, my friend. So Olivia, and then see if you had a follow up.
Yeah, I just have like one follow-up question. So you used Bernie Sanders as an example. What about his policies are socialist in a time like this? Because to my knowledge, he has almost taken a middle-of-the-road stance on what's happening right now with Palestine. And by extension, even before that, he lost the presidential race, in my view, split the vote, which allowed Trump to win in 2016 and in 2020. There were still people who voted for him even when he wasn't on the ballot. So what about him is reconstituting socialism?
First of all, he didn't, he's not the reason that Trump won 2016. I don't think anybody blames some handful of people that voted for Sanders in 2016. I mean, Hillary Clinton is the reason that Trump won in 2016. And if Trump wins now, which is a good chance, it would be because of Joe Biden, not because of what else.
I mean, in some ways, Trump and Sanders, I think, were taking up similar discontents.
Yeah, that's kind of what
Yeah.
I mean. He embodied this like socialist candidate for people, but to me, he was not a socialist.
Oh, Sanders.
Yeah.
Well, he's a social democrat. You know, there are certain, you know, we can't go back and make everything on the basis of does the government own it, that's socialism, or is it a market, that's capitalism. You can use markets, we can use markets to benefit things, and just because the government runs something does not necessarily mean it's socialistic. It can be bureaucratic, it can be a disaster, and so forth. We have to be more flexible about that. The basic question of what are the values, what are the goals that politics is advancing. You know, and Sanders put working class people, ordinary people, ordinary life, you know, at the center. And Sanders didn't lose in 2020. They, you know, ganged up on him by putting Biden in. That was an internal conspiracy centered on Obama to get rid of Sanders. Sanders would have won the nomination. I don't know if he would have won the election. But they didn't let him continue. They got Buttigieg and Klobuchar, you know, to resign on the same day. And when they had the South Carolina convention, that, you know, we had pretty much a machine, a Democratic machine, and they were able to deliver South Carolina to Biden. And that's what pushed Sanders out. It was, you know, it was a centrist in the Democratic Party that did
Medicare for all. That's socialist, right? Huh? He made Medicare for all popular, right? That's socialist.
Yeah. We had
A stack, and you'll be next, my brother, okay? Yeah, okay. Yes, please.
I've been thinking a lot. Because I've been seeing a lot of like people coming out and people organizing against top cities, saying like these kids have no tactics. Like why are you like just getting arrested? And then I've been like hearing all of you guys, and I think it's just interesting to think of it from like less of a theoretical perspective and saying like this instance right now, this resistance it kind of defies a lot of how we're speaking about this because these are kids, these are in the diaspora. Like this is affecting people who like are not able to return. And they don't need to be read up on theory. They are fighting for 75 years of occupation, and so like they don't have like to call it like that they're the left. Like I don't even know if they would be the left. Like, these are people who are just here because they have been displaced because of leftist, right, like politics for years. So these are just people who now are like, we've been fed all this shit. Our families are suffering. Like we don't know left from right. We are just here because we have so much anger, so much sadness, so much rage built up. For 75 years we're talking about Palestine, but then so much longer than that from the Middle East. And so I've been thinking a lot about this and how if we want to even like talk about it as like if they're radical, if they're the left, like I think that it defies a lot of this, and I think that's why this moment is so potent because people are just here with their feelings, whether or not they're like read up or like have the techniques or the tactics. And so I think it's interesting to think of it as like leftist fascism, but I'm just like, these are just kids who are like fighting for their tatas and jidus and their family back home, and they don't know what else to do other than exactly what they're doing. And so I think the question becomes, how do we come up with a new way to organize and a new way to like think about all of this that isn't like leftist or any of that? And I don't have the answers to that, but I think that these spaces are like where we can come up with those ideas. So yeah, that's all.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true that it's not necessarily like the left in, for instance, Palestine has clearly been decimated, like historically. Like the left in Palestine that might have once existed really doesn't exist in the same way today. Same with the left in Israel, actually, and in much of the world, right? Like leftist groups and leftist organizations that might have exist aren't there. I also think it's true that like one's response to suffering isn't necessarily left or right, and so there's a question of like what the role of the left is in history and what the relationship of our discontents with our suffering is to the question of freedom and socialism, and that's what I'm kind of trying to pose. I mean, I would kind of following, this is another like thinker of the period of the New Left, Leszek Kolakowski, wrote an essay that we read in Platypus called On the Concept of the Left. And there he tried to understand the relationship of the left and the right, which of course come from the French Revolution. And he says in that essay that the right only needs tactics because the right tends to preserve the status quo, right? The right doesn't see possibility for change, but instead tries to preserve what is. And so they only need tactics to do that. They don't necessarily need theoretical clarity. Whereas the left needs utopia as a tool, but it also needs theoretical clarification of what the goal is, right? Because it's both, like the left is both tasked with destroying the existing house and building a new one. And he uses that sort of metaphor. And so I think historically the role of the left was to be critical, right? It was a critique of social reality. And that includes not just like, you know, I think today we think of thinking about society or thinking about social reality in very like narrow terms, right? Writing an econ paper about what these people do, but it also means a criticism of our ideas about what we're doing. And I think that in history, the left tried to clarify how ideas that people have, discontents people have, political movements, new phenomena of our society, socially, economically, and politically, might point towards the opportunity to transform the world to further our freedom. And I think that's what, you know, the idea of the socialist revolution was about. I think that socialism arose, you know, within the ideology of socialism arose because of the crisis of capitalism, right? It was kind of an idea that people had, and Marx criticized it. He didn't criticize it because he hated it. He criticized it because he thought that the demand for socialism was, you know, a symptom of the potential and actually the necessity of a revolution. And I think that's what Marxism, you know, as part of the history of the left, which has moved people in the past and in some fundamental ways created the world we live in today, at least in the deeper history. I think that's what it was trying to do. It was trying to criticize. And so, I think that one can be against capitalism in a right-wing way, right? And our discontents with reality can, of course, actually lead to the continuation of that reality. Despite, all good intentions and these sorts of things, I think there is actually a necessity for, what's been called critical theory, and this is the role Marxism played, of a left to clarify all of these things. And I think that today there's sort of an abandonment of that task, right? So people are horrified by what's happening in Gaza. People are horrified by, war. And of course, who wouldn't be horrified by war, right? Who wouldn't be horrified by all of the destruction that's caused, by capitalism all around the world that happens all the time, right? The poverty that you see, all these sorts of things. But that there isn't really any sort of, it seems like no one is trying to clarify what our goals might be. And that people feel, it's almost existentialist. Actually, it reminds me a lot of existentialism. Which, Sartre really became famous because of his opposition to fascism in France, right, when the Communist Party didn't seem to oppose it. And this idea that, well, if we can't be free, if we can't change the world, at least I can, refuse to participate in the horrors that are happening. But I don't know that action actually makes humanity more conscious of itself. That really seems to me to be the problem, is how does any of this relate to socialism? I don't know that it has much to do with socialism. I don't think what's happening on the campuses really has to do with socialism. I think a lot of people have said that. I know people were upset about what Norman Finkelstein said at the Columbia protest.
What did he say?
He was criticizing, so first he said we need to not worry about our political differences, but he was criticizing the protest, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And he said Palestine should be replaced with Palestinian. And he kind of said that's like Bernie's Medicare for All. It's a good slogan everybody can get around. But I remember thinking...
He added on to that slogan at the New School as well. From the river to the sea, Palestinians will be free, and added on, one man, one vote should be added to the slogan.
Oh, well, okay, that too. But just thinking about what I knew, I was thinking, well, Norm is actually saying this because he's saying that, it's less nationalist. There is kind of a political content that it might be problematic for leftists to end up, supporting nationalist politics. And I felt okay, yeah, this question of how we relate, does the demand for national liberation have a relationship to socialism, and what is it? That's not really being worked out at all. And it's actually taken for granted that, nationalism is better than what's happening. And what's that going to mean? It's going to mean the exploitation of Palestinians by their own leaders. Let's just be serious. That's what's going to happen. And it's going to be horrifying, too. It'll be horrifying in a different way than what we're experiencing now, but it will be horrifying. That's, I think the experience of nationalist movements in the 20th century, is that they led to the exploitation of those people. So, all of these things today, I just feel like there's a whole host of historical problems that we're not thinking about. And that actually, any questions posed by it are kind of being pushed aside in the name of resistance. And I think that we're going to, people are going to pay for that in the long run. That's not actually helping us, make a revolution for socialism. It could make obstacles, not for us right now, but for people in the future, students who learn from this 20 years from now.
I totally agree with you. I do. And that, to me, just resisting. That's not the left. It's the left who is the reflection of the resistance. It's what you just said. But it is also the case. This question about the relationship between nationalism and stuff, it's come up over and over again. Marx and Engels wrote about it all the time. Fanon and people. So, but I totally agree with that. That is why we need a left. We don't need a left to go on the street and beat the drums. We definitely need people to do that. But people are going to do that because they're suddenly going to realize something and it's great. But we actually need organizations like Platypus that add some thought to it. I agree with you.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Uh, why do you think that? Why do you think that? In I think everywhere else but America, the like younger people are becoming like in America. There's more young people being left wing than in other countries like Germany. Like the most popular party in Germany among young people is like the AfD. Why do you think that's different across the world than
You think
here?
we have more of a left here?
Like among like young people, like more of a I don't know a positive view of
I'm
left wing.
not sure that that's true. I don't know. I'm not sure that. I mean, I think it's very easy to underestimate the resources of the left in the United States because we didn't have strong Marxist parties, but we have very strong workers' movements, workers, and also the liberal tradition, even though it is inextricable from capitalism, it has very powerful emancipatory elements. So, civil rights, civil liberties is crucial. And feminism and so forth. The United States, because it's such a liberal country, has had, like feminism, for example, a lot of that has come out of the United States. But I'm not sure that we have, the most left-wing kids in the world. I'm not sure about that.
Do you mind answering the same question, Erin? I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Oh, what I have to say about the AfD in Germany. I mean, I think the AfD in Germany is a lot like the Trump phenomenon in the United States. I think that these two things, for all of the kind of skirm and drum about it, and I'm very aware of this because I was a student when Trump was elected. Okay, I was an undergraduate, so I'm a PhD student now, but when I was an undergraduate, my second year of college at the University of Chicago was the Trump election. So I was, there, I kind of experienced it back at the beginning, and there was a lot of talk of, it was very strange. I remember being in a panel that had, who are the people? Doug Henwood, Lisa Featherstone, Yasmin Nair. They're leftists in Chicago who were holding a panel at the bookstore at UChicago. And they were talking about like how Hillary Clinton was like this evil warmonger who was like going to get everybody killed, and she's the opposite of feminism, and she's horrible in all these ways. And then they would say that, and then they'd say, but you have to vote for her because you have to stop Trump. And if Trump is elected, I remember somebody in the audience just asked very innocuously, dear sirs, what do we do if Trump is elected? And Doug Henwood said, kill yourself. And I remember thinking, whoa, like, what is this? Because he's going to put people in camps and like whatever. And that kind of didn't happen, right? Trump's no like socialist. I'm not saying anything like that, but he really isn't like fascism. And I think the AfD is similar. They represent changes in capitalism, right? And I think that, people are going to be, inspired by that change. In the 1980s, the right said they were making the revolution, right? So there's the Reagan Revolution. They were the revolutionaries because the left's not. I think even in the 90s, Newt Gingrich was like, we're doing the Republican Revolution in Congress, right? So the right kind of, when the left ends up defending the old reality, which is what we have now, the left is kind of defending neoliberalism because they're horrified by how capitalism is changing, then the right takes up the kind of necessity of change. Capitalism is revolutionary, right? Capitalism is a revolutionary form of society that has to renew itself through transformation. And the socialist revolution isn't just opposed to that revolution, right? But it's seeking to kind of work through the contradictions of the revolution of capitalism and turn what could be just another capitalist revolution for the continuation of the status quo into the socialist revolution, which would fundamentally transform society, right? And so, I think like the world, like that revolution still seems necessary, but the left's not taking it up, so people are interested in the right. And I think we'll see more young people become, conservatives in America. Because the left's not doing anything. The left's not, and socialists, there aren't socialists out there who could rule or govern. There really aren't. There's not an alternative on offer. And so I think just like in, and people are upset. And right now, the SPD is in power in Germany. People really don't like the SPD. and even the left is criticizing the SPD very heavily. I was in Berlin a couple months ago, actually, so I heard people on the left talking about the SPD. And they're seen as, basically the last defenders of austerity in Germany, which is what everyone is suffering from, right? Is the austerity that's making everybody poor, it's devaluing, everything. And so people are upset with that, and the only alternative on offer is the AfD. It's not, the left's not there, the socialists aren't there.
SPD is center-right, right? SPD, that's center-right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But they're supported in a kind of weird way by Die Linke and these other leftist parties. So, because in the name of stopping the AfD, that's like what happened is people were like, we got to support these people we hate in the SPD because we can't allow the AfD to, be in power. They're so beyond the pale. And I think, what's beyond the pale about the AfD, really? I mean, of course, whenever you have a mass movement, there are lots of people in it who have lots of different beliefs. But what's the leadership of the AfD seems to just be following Trump, and Trump is like a right Democrat from the 90s. That's what he is. And he's, changing some foreign policy things. He's changing this, he's changing that. But at the end of the day, the only president in the last 8 years who's been accused of genocide is Joe. It's not Trump. So, I really think that all my professors who were telling me he was going to be the end of the world, it kind of wasn't true. It's not great, but it's not any worse either. And I think that people are going to see that, and if there's no left, then they're going to follow the right. We're leaving politics up to the right, giving them leadership. That's what the left has done.
So we have about 15 minutes left. I want to suggest we take 12.
Yeah.
2 more questions. And so if anybody has
Or
comments, yes.
Can you help clarify the dispute between Marcuse and Adorno? Because I think you raised an interesting point about how, we don't need the left to go out there and do the protests and to bang the drums, and that we need the left instead to be critical of that. But it appears that Adorno wasn't even though he was sympathetic, that he wasn't willing to be kind of the theory to their practice. So I was wondering if you could clarify the nature of that dispute, because it appears that Marcuse was precisely that, what you're describing.
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple of things to lay out. I'll try and be quick because I know we have other things. But so in an earlier conversation in the 50s called Towards a New Manifesto between Adorno and Horkheimer, Marcuse is not involved, but he's their homeboy. They're talking about it all the time, right? Whatever. They are talking about, what does it mean to be an intellectual? What does it mean to be a theoretician? Because they're thinking about, should we write a new communist manifesto? And they feel like they can't because the context they would need is the party. That actually, without the party mediating the relationship between the intellectuals and the working class, and between theory and practice with the end goal of socialism, right? Without being able to kind of apprehend and think about the meaning not only of their practice but of their theory itself, what are the conditions of theory, that one isn't able to be a theorist in the Marxist sense. One isn't able to play the role that Marx played without that context. And they feel they've been kicked out, basically, of the Communist Party. You can't go be a theoretician in the Communist Party. Some of the surrealists, funnily enough, tried to do this. So Andre Breton and others were questioned thoroughly by the Communist Party for trying to come and be intellectuals there, Marxist intellectuals, and were not really allowed to do anything. So you kind of can't be there. And they said, well, the Trotskyists believe they're just going to be invited back into the Politburo any day now. They're just doing the theory, and someday, some fine day, the Politburo will say, Mr. James Cannon, come back. You were right, we were wrong. And they're like, that's not going to happen. So what is it that needs to be done? There needs to be, he thinks, a clarification of the failure of Marxism in the past, right? And a sort of disillusionment of the kind of bad ideas and practices that the young people are learning from Stalinism, right? So that's what he tries to do with the musical youth movement, for instance, tries to disabuse it of certain kind of false assumptions that are going to lead them down the wrong path. Okay, so that's one thing. That's one idea. Is to be a theoretician, one must be in the party. Now to get to Marcuse and Adorno. Marcuse does not believe that the students are in a revolutionary or a pre-revolutionary situation. He says that many times in many books. That's what One-Dimensional Man is about. He's saying, okay, everybody is saying that you can't have a revolution right now. Yeah, that's probably true. It seems as though everything is integrated into capitalism. He's writing in the 60s. It's not a revolutionary moment. So he's looking to what seems to be outside of that one-dimensional integration. And he's saying, well, maybe this is the opportunity for something. What is that something? The sense I get from reading some of his writings is that that something is the reconstitution of emancipatory politics, the creation of something like a party or something like the theory that they've been missing. And he thinks that the student movement is an opportunity for that. Now, it might have been. The problem is then, what is it that's going to do that? Is it a theoretical clarification or is it praxis? And so Marcuse is saying, well, this is praxis, which will change things such that we can become theoreticians, whereas Adorno is saying, no, praxis is blocked. This is a pseudo-praxis. It's praxis in the absence of any possible praxis, and therefore all it's going to do is create a pseudo-ideology to justify it. And what we have to do is clarify this problem of theory and practice that goes back to the death of Marxism. And so what happens is the students do create a theory of why you don't need a party. That's true. They kind of create a theory of why you don't need a party, why you can do practice and you can do theory and you can unite them without all of that old stuff. So that's really like the core of the difference is praxis fundamentally blocked in the 60s? And are the 60s an actual advance on Stalinism, or are they just a repetition of the defeat of Stalinism? I'd say that's really at the heart of it. And people think that Marcuse thought there was going to be a revolution. No. He says it like a million times, but he doesn't think it's revolutionary. He thinks instead that it might, open up a space for the rebirth of revolutionary politics. That's kind of what he thought. And to that end, he tries to write he tries to analyze what they're doing. And that kind of happens in this much abused interview with him about the May uprisings, which is used to turn Marcuse into all sort of, he supports anything and everything the New Left did, and he supports any and every, form of politics that we're going to do now. Which I think is too bad, because I think he was trying to be critical, right? But it was a different estimation of the historical moment and what was happening. Oh, I'm sorry, that was longer than I meant, because we have to end pretty soon.
5 minutes.
One final question, anyone?
I'll take it up if no one else, but I'll give the floor to...
We got 5 minutes.
Anyone?
Let's
okay, let me reverse it.
Daniel to leave.
So my question is for you, Eli. You've raised the liberal tradition in the United States as a potential resource for the left. And that means raising the specter of 1776 and the Constitution and the potential as we move towards a possible constitutional crisis in the forthcoming election, as it were. And so, of course, to bring to bear history, right? Marx says in his letter on behalf of the International Working Men's Association to Abraham Lincoln that the idea of a great democratic republic first sprang up in these United States, that the destiny of the European working class is inscribed upon the Star-Spangled Banner. Lenin says in the results and significance of the presidential election in 1912 that the United States is where freedom is most complete. Eugene Debs articulates that if Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson were still alive, they would be in the Socialist Party, as it were. So does 1776 and the American Revolution, does it still task us today? Does it task the students who are occupying the university today?
No, that's a good question. It's not really 1776. 1776 is a national revolution. It's a separation from, it's a colonial revolution. It doesn't, it does have the Declaration of Independence, which then becomes a resource that Lincoln goes back to and so forth. But no, we have an incredible legacy in the United States that, it's not really just the liberal. It's about a liberal radical synthesis that takes place periodically in the United States. The abolition of slavery was an absolutely amazing thing. I was a socialist. I am a socialist, but it was, when I was a young socialist, my mentors would point out we can do the same thing with the banks that they did with the slaves. Slaves were the most valuable. In other words, you didn't need the violence. You have the resources. Slaves were the most valuable form of capital in the United States, and that was simply appropriated. And the slaveholders were not compensated. When England abolished slavery in Jamaica in 1833, they compensated the slaveholders. We didn't compensate the slaveholders. It is true we didn't carry through on that revolution, just since it's the last thing, I really want to stress the importance of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Those are the basic. That is freedom of assembly. I mean, Donna Shalala came to us, to our faculty, and said, "What should we do?" And we said, "Celebrate it." This is the left needs that, and the left didn't invent those things. A lot of leftists do not understand how fundamental liberal freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to demonstrate, freedom to voice your opinion. In the history of the labor movement, for example, the time when they didn't have that issue on their side, and every time that they had that issue, because the courts would try to stop the labor unions with injunctions, and then the labor unions would fight back by saying we have freedom to assemble. Every time they raised that issue, they would win. So, there are resources in the liberal tradition, but we still need a critique of capitalism.
I mean, I think, speaking from the perspective of at Columbia specifically, especially, seems to me that kind of what's happening is that all of the COVID measures, all these sorts of lockdown measures are now being used to shut down freedom of speech at the university. All of the sorts of, and they even had created this too. They'd already started vetting speakers that students would invite back because of the protests against right-wing speakers, and now it's being turned against the left, of course. I mean, it's been impossible for us to hold a panel at Columbia all year because they've been using these new bureaucratic policies to stop us from having any discussions of politics. So I think it's going to be, a real problem for students coming back in the fall. That, part of the legacy of this, from the perspective of the university, is going to be greater control of student speech and student discussion.
It's incredible, the pushback, much greater than in the 1960s, against these demonstrations that has taken place. And also the Jewish, AIPAC, I have to say, the power of the Jewish, I'm Jewish, I'm not being, but anyway.
Okay.
So we've got a Erin.
Erin.
All right.
What's your last name?
Hagood.
Spell it.
Hagood.
This one's okay, we're officially wrapping up the teach-in. For anyone that's interested, we will be hosting reading groups. Next week, we're going to be discussing Trotsky, Leninism and Bolshevism, and the lessons of October.
Stalinism and Bolshevism.
Stalinism and Bolshevism, sorry. And we host our reading groups every week at Lang B354C on the 3rd floor on the 11th Street building, 4 to 6:30 p.m. on Thursdays. You can find our flyers with our WhatsApp groups for regular updates all around the building. We encourage you all to come. We also host our coffee breaks Mondays 12 to 2 p.m. at the Lang Building Cafe at 11th Street. This is where you can discuss anything you want to bring up, any questions, concerns, anything at all is open for discussion. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. All right.
Thank you.
And we will be having a